Shalom, friends, and welcome back to Judaism Unplugged. I'm still Rabbi Steve Wiseman of Temple Solel here in Bowie. And this video is one of our series of historical pieces. We've been counting down the 18 significant periods or points in Jewish history as focal points to try and understand the sweep of Jewish history. This video is entitled When I Fall. It looks at the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians in 586, the events leading up to it, and far more significantly, the events coming out of the capture of Jerusalem and the destruction of the first temple by forces under the leadership of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylonia. As we saw in the last video, in which the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed in 723 by the Assyrians, the disappearance of the 10 northern tribes, both into history and geographically, was a significant influence on the development of the Judaism that followed. Still to this day, we talk about the 10 lost tribes, because much like Charlie on the NTA, we lament that they never returned, at least in a recognizable form. And we noted in that video that part of the reason for that was that many of them probably simply migrated south and became part of the kingdom of Judah. The others who were taken captive in Assyria may never have had the opportunity to return. But there's enough historical evidence that between the destruction first of the north and then the south in 586, there was an opportunity for Jews to head south, particularly in 586, away from the approaching Babylonians. We know Jeremiah the prophet went south into Egypt instead of allowing himself to be taken captive into Babylonia. We know the reported history of the Jews of Ethiopia when they were reunited and airlifted back to Israel back at the end of the last century, indicates that they trace themselves back to King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. And so would indicate that there was a significant migration in that direction. There are groups within Uganda, the Luganda tribe, who seem similarly to have just continued to migrate until ending where they are now in Uganda, who have very much maintained what we believe Judaism looked like at the time. And there are even further flung examples, plenty of contenders for the roles of the alleged 10 lost tribes, all of which assumes that they would have maintained their tribal identities into significant exile and across a significant amount of time, none of which seems to be proven or necessary in history. But at the start of the 6th century BCE, there's a new player in the game in the Fertile Crescent. Assyria has had its run and is taken over by the forces of Babylonia, in part because the Babylonians found a way to be more nimble in taking prisoners that allowed their economy to flourish more by not creating a bigger burden by bringing back everybody they could bring as a slave or a captive, which was the Assyrian way. The Babylonians only brought back the leadership and the educated elite. They had enough workers, apparently, at least by the time they captured Jerusalem. And as a result, they didn't suffer from the economic drain of a significant servile class like the Assyrians did, which allowed them first to take over what the Assyrians had conquered and then to push on. And starting at about 597 BCE, there is a pretty constant drumbeat coming from the north from the forces of the Babylonians. There's a siege of Jerusalem reported in 597 BCE. There's a very near capture of the city as part of that siege. And it's pretty clear that the intervening 100 years have not been a great time for Judah either. We had significant societal upheaval under Hezekiah as part of the reckoning with that sense of endangerment by the Assyrians. And then there's another significant societal evolution, revolution, call it what you will, under the reign of King Josiah, a little past mid-7th century, that may not have taken as much effect as the biblical text would like us to believe it did, and may in part have been responsible in the minds of the inhabitants of Judah, whose worldview was very much that when foreign enemies were at our doorstep, it was because our God was angry at us because we did something wrong. So to the Jews in Jerusalem and Judah, it wasn't the Babylonians who were assailing them, it was the hand of God. The Babylonians were the embodiment. By 586, it has all broken down. Troops under Nebuchadnezzar attack Jerusalem, capture it, set fire to and destroy the temple, and carry off into exile the leaders, the court, the priests, the prophets, and leave behind the rabble with no major institutions and nobody to run them. And that's a very different reality than the fate of the 10 northern tribes of Israel, who during their exile disappeared. So it appears that in the Babylonian captivity, those who were taken captive had fairly cushy roles. They served as house servants. They served as tutors to the children. They weren't the serf class of slave, the abused worker type that we think of when we think of prisoners of war being taken captive and forced to work. And it appears that they may have had a certain amount of freedom within Babylonian society as well. The ability to actually meet with each other regularly and move around somewhat. There is a significant school of thought that believes that because of who was taken captive in Babylonia and the circumstances, that it created the perfect opportunity, the combination of motive and opportunity for the collection of disparate folk tales and official records of the court and the priesthood and teachings of the people to all be combined into a single document during the exile in Babylonia. Because one of the things we note is that coming back from Babylonia at the end of the exile is a document that is not referred to before the fall of Jerusalem. One that is read to the people upon the return of Ezra and Nehemiah as clearly established leaders sent by the Persian leadership after they've conquered Babylon. That document is called Torat Moshe. And scholars believe that it, either in part or in whole, it was the same document that we today call Torah. The question of whether it was just the 5 books or whether either Joshua or Judges or both were part of Torat Moshe is an area of debate for the scholars still. But it's entirely possible that the canonization, the final compilation and editing and canonization of the document we call Torah may have happened in the exile in Babylonia. And that's a significant statement that carries a lot of potential weight. In the next video, we're going to look at the return under the Persians, which is a really challenging period itself. But in looking at 586, we see the end of an era. It took conquest by the Babylonians for the end of the dynastic line from King David as rulers of Judah, the southern kingdom, to come to an end. And even then, it may not have immediately come to an end, as we'll see next time. We see the absence of leadership and institutions during the exile, the rabble going their own ways, doing what they have to do to survive. We see the emergence of a new group called the Samaritans, probably made up of those rabble, and particularly that part of those who were left behind who may not have been so quick to join back in when Jerusalem was rebuilt and the Second Temple period begins under Ezra and Nehemiah. They may have remained separate. We see during the period of the exile that, as we mentioned last time, some went south. Some avoided the captivity completely by fleeing to the south. We see Jeremiah in Egypt. We see a significant Jewish presence in Ethiopia, formerly called the Falasha, which is actually a pejorative term, so we try to avoid it. Many of whom were brought home to Israel in airlifts at the end of the 20th century. We see isolated bands of Jews in places like Uganda, possibly even in West Africa, whose journeys to where we find those traditions, if not those Jewish communities today, most likely occurred with the fall of Jerusalem in 586. What's interesting in the larger context is that even though this is a time of significant turmoil in the Fertile Crescent, with first the Babylonians taking over the Assyrian Empire, leading to them taking Jerusalem, and then relatively quickly thereafter the Persians conquering Babylon, there doesn't appear to be a lot of skirmishing with Egypt during this period, with most of the intermediate land blocks out of the way, with both Israel and Judah wiped out. So it's an intriguing period, both externally and internally. Now we know when the exile ends, and we'll talk more about this in the next video, the people are given certain expectations of behavior by the leadership, which in the histories written by those loyal to those leaders are immediately embraced by the people. But for the first time, we also have documents that seem to indicate a significant alternative point of view. So, for example, Ezra gets up and tells the people who have married non-Jewish wives in the interim that they need to give up their non-Jewish wives and children. And according to the accounting in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, the people respond with, "Whatever you say, we will do," much like their ancestors did when Moses told them what God wanted at Sinai. Even though this was a fairly draconian demand. And then we get a small little biblical book called the Book of Ruth. A really touching story of the relationship between a Moabite widow and her mother-in-law, also a widow, that seems to have a fairy tale and storybook ending, to which is appended a genealogy that comes from that storybook ending, that would indicate that the great-grandmother of King David himself was a Moabite woman, who would have been one of the wives that Ezra would have the people give up because they weren't Jewish. And when you recognize that truth, it's hard to imagine that that wasn't why the book of Ruth was written and became popular enough to be included in the canon as an alternative to the demand that those non-Jewish wives and children had to be given up by the Jews who had been left behind. So the destruction in 586 was a huge upheaval. It effectively ended a society. It ended an era in Jewish history. It caused dramatic change. And next video, we will see how some of that change came to be. But some of the changes that occurred during the exile still impact us today. Namely, the cohesion and the canonization and the centralization of a document called Torah, which, when we come back to Judah and Jerusalem, becomes not only the religious centerpiece of the people, but their political constitution as well. A duality that will have dramatic impact as our tale of history marches forward. 586, the destruction of the first temple, the conquest of Judah by the Babylonians. Certainly one of the 18 most significant dates or periods in Jewish history. As always, if you have questions, we invite them by email, which you can send by way of the Temple Solel webpage at templesolelmd.org. Until next time, I wish you shalom, friends, and we'll see you in our next video.